social and economic rights must be subject to effective remedies. And that could be said to really have been culminated in the adoption of the optional protocol to the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and it's coming into force on the 20th, pretty close to the 20th anniversary of Vienna. So, you know, on the one hand, that's a relatively minor institutional reform that provides for a complaints mechanism that's going to be used by relatively few people in, at the moment, relatively few countries. But what it represents in terms of a paradigm shift that we have struggled for, in terms of the real inclusion of social and economic rights within the human rights movement, is really, I think, immensely profound and significant. And I think we have to realize that the resistance to that procedure was really a resistance to recognizing that social and economic rights claimants must have access to effective remedies. That doesn't have to always be traditional remedies in courts, but I think that we've seen the damage that has been done to the human rights movement, to our understandings of justice, to our understandings of the accountabilities of governments, and I think ultimately to what's happened in social policy and to our concepts of democracy over the last 20 years, because what we haven't seen progress in fact, we've seen regression in the idea that dignity and security and equality does have something to do with the way in which we organize societies in terms of access to work, access to adequate income, access to adequate housing. And so while we've seen progress in some areas of civil and political rights, we've generally seen backwards movement, both in the affluent countries and in the emerging economies. And I think that the fact that we have denied a meaningful voice to the claimants of social and economic rights in very many ways, both in terms of access to justice, access to hearings, and in terms of meaningful participation within our own human rights movement, I think these have had profound effects, and so that we can take the adoption of the optional protocol as a call to action, so that the next generation, the next struggle has to be to make that voice meaningful, to make access to justice really work, to effect meaningful change to the way in which social and economic organizations have excluded particular groups and denied them the basic requirements of dignity and security. I think the most significant obstacle that we have faced in terms of our understanding of human rights is that when we've talked about social and economic rights, we've tended to think about the, and in terms of justiciability and access to justice and so on, we've tended to focus on the relationship between courts and legislatures. And we've forgotten about what all this means to rights claimants. So if you look at the debates, at the way in which this issue has been analyzed and argued over the last 20 years, you'll see a lot of discussion about what's the role of the court, what's the role of the legislature. Do we want to give more power to courts, more power to legislatures? So when we talk about power, we're talking about power as if it's only a question of courts and legislatures. And the real question, of course, is the power of that we need to shift to the rights claiming groups whose rights are at stake in terms of social and economic rights violations. And, you know, ultimately, rights claiming is about transforming systems of exclusion and powerlessness and silencing into meaningful participation and voice and ability to effect change. It's not about just getting access to a court. But we've distorted the debate, and by distorting the debate, I think we've lost the meaningful participation and inclusion of people living in poverty and homelessness. And you see it in our meetings, you see it in human rights institutions, that the groups who are the potential claimants of social and economic rights are often missing. And so the biggest obstacle we face is somehow understanding how we can meaningfully include the most marginalized groups within the human rights movement, which is supposed to ultimately place them at the center. A very critical issue is going to be changing our understandings of access to justice and effective remedies into ways that actually make a difference for people living on the ground. And so we have to stop thinking that courts work this way and studying whether or not this worked or that worked when we took social and economic rights claims to court, or human rights tribunals or human rights institutions work this way, and when we took social and economic rights claims to them, did they work or didn't they work? What we have to do is start saying these social and economic rights claims have to be given adequate hearings, they have to be subject to effective remedies. If it didn't work here, why didn't it work? If it didn't work here, why? What needs to change in terms of our understanding of what a hearing looks like, our understanding of what of how a court should behave, our understanding of what the role of courts and of human rights institutions really is. We're looking at a whole new area of rights claiming, rights adjudication, rights enforcement, and we're doomed to failure if we simply apply the old models and assume that they're going to work for these new types of claims. Similarly, if we only take social and economic rights claims forward that fit the old model, then I think we miss the most egregious violations, and we exclude the people who have some of the most important rights claims to advance. So the real challenge is to turn around the way we've been thinking about this and give really meaningful voice to those who have the rights claims, and redefine our institutions around giving them a meaningful hearing and effective remedy.